Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here the first time at this conference, and the idea was of the organization that we bring some legal light into the discussions, and this is why we have been set up so early and of this conference. And I have the pleasure to be here with two of my colleagues, Marcel, Hörauf, a partner in our Frankfurt office, who is a regulatory expert, and my colleague from Washington, D.C., David Beam. He is a digital payment specialist in the United States and can tell us a lot about the developments in this space in the United States. And I'm Patrick Scholl. I'm the CAT of Capital Markets and Regulatory at Mayer Brown in Germany. With that, David, your opening remarks.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. This is actually the first time in my career I've spoken outside the United States at a presentation, so I was deeply excited to be invited here. Last night at the speaker's reception, I was thinking about the first, we didn't call it a crypto asset conference, first virtual currency conference I went to many years ago, and I think it was back in like 2011. And back then, of course, virtual currency basically meant Bitcoin and some other hypothetical things that might come out in the future. But it was a different conference. When you went there, it was a lot of people who had this idea that seemed improbable to most people, but they were dreamers, and they had this dream of a financial asset that would work on totally different principles from other financial assets and would just revolutionize how the financial world worked and how we made payments and how we did everything. And I think that if you could get a time machine and go back in time and bring those people who, again, were dreamers at the time and bring them here 15 years forward to 2026 to this conference, I think they'd say, oh my God, the dream has become a nightmare. Who let the bankers into the virtual currency conference? I mean, they thought by 2026 Bitcoin was going to kill the banks, that all the bankers would be on the street saying, please, can you spare Satoshi? I haven't eaten in days. It was just received wisdom that this was going to displace everything. And the other thing is, you would never have heard at those conferences something that Dominic said in the last panel, which is regulations are friend, not our enemy. That was very much not the attitude at the time. The belief was that blockchain protocols replaced the need for any kind of law. This was supposed to be a system that existed outside the legal infrastructure and the control of governments. Of course, a lot of things have changed, and what we found is that while there was a lot of genius in Satoshi's idea for the Bitcoin, and it's been deployed in many other fronts, you do need a legal infrastructure to make this work and for this to become widespread in a standard way to conduct financial instruments. And I think that that's really, well, they might have thought, I'm sure many of them would have thought this was a nightmare where we've come to. I think it's actually realization of a dream for many, and it does show the potential of this, not just the potential, the realized potential already, but even the further potential in the future. If we can get regulation right, and I think that's the challenge.
Great, thanks, David. We thought of giving, a very high-level overview of our thoughts from 15,000 feet or so, and from a European German law perspective, one might say we have a lot of regulation in place already, right? We have the MiCA framework. On the security side, we have tokenized securities. We've just discussed them. We have DLT pilot regime. We have a new market integrity or integration package just launched. We have laws on digital securities in Germany and other member states. You could still think or say we're lacking a little bit of entire integration and uniform rules across 27 member states. But we're on a good way, and I think in terms of regulation, we have made significant progress over the last years. So apart from this integration piece, I think the regulatory side is in a good way. We come to that in a little more detail later. But when discussing these kind of regulatory frameworks and issues, what I often hear is, we need to look at the US. Everything is much better and well in shape, and they really make it work. So I'm today very interested to hear about your thoughts. What is the US perspective on that, and is it so much better in the US, so to speak, and what can we learn from you?
But when you first told me the title of the panel, that it was going to focus on what Europe can learn from the U.S. in terms of law and regulation of digital assets, I said, really? I don't think there should be anything that the U.S. or the Europe should be learning from the U.S. And that's not to say that things are completely disaster in the U.S. I think in both sides of the Atlantic, there's jurisdictions are working through some challenges. They're coming to terms with the fact that crypto assets function on different principles than any other financial asset in existence, and that does mean you need to think about regulating them and the legal principles that govern them in different ways. But I think the perception, I don't think from the U.S. lawyer perspective, I wouldn't say the U.S. has certainly up to date been a model for how to approach this. It's still figuring it out. Up until now, we've had a cumbersome regime for many types of crypto asset users where at the state level, you may or may not be a money transmitter and may or may not need 50 separate state licenses just to operate in the United States. At the federal level, there's been questions about whether or not something is a security and basically the standard that governs whether a crypto asset is security is a test adopted by the Supreme Court in 1946. Now, I will say, I'm sure, I realize I'm speaking in a civil law country where the idea that, the answer to the question of whether a crypto asset is security, someone says, is answered in 1946 would seem especially broad. It seems a little less weird to us in the United States in our common law system, but it still is taking a very old standard and trying to apply it to a contemporary asset, and that does lead to uncertainty. And we've had jurisdictional battles at the federal level between the SEC and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and so there's a lot to work out. And the recent Genius Act, does a lot for stablecoins. It establishes at least the framework within which regulators at the federal level can establish rules to implement it that will govern stablecoins, and it would also kind of preempt, not just kind of, would preempt all these state laws, so you'd have a single federal regime. I think that's going to be huge progress for stablecoins. We have another law, the Clarity Act, working its way through Congress that probably is going to get passed, and it will now try to bring some clarity to regulation of other types of crypto assets.
Let's go into a little more detail on the security side. Maybe we can split this discussion and first focus on the security side, and then of course on the crypto asset side and stablecoin side. Just maybe if we compare both legal regimes, Patrick, could you briefly outline what our European perspective is on the security side?
Yeah, I think it's important because in all these discussions, things are often mixed up, legal things. And I think this is why always we caution people thinking about terms. Yeah, the crypto terms is used for so many different things at this point in time. So please don't mix things up. And we come to securities. Yeah, I think it's one point that is really important to consider. First of all, we have native digital securities, and this is more or less our primary objective going forward, I think. And these are based on not regulation, it's based on civil law principles, and there needs to be insolvency protection. Yeah, this is not where the European legal system as well as the US legal system is finally there. Yeah, in Germany we are on good terms. We at least have an act, the German Electronic Securities Act, which is a model act, I think, for Europe. But on a global scale, I think it would be better to harmonize the legal systems into Europe when it comes to European security, digital securities, and more or less it would be beneficial if we have a kind of a European Digital Securities Act, yeah, so that we have in all 27 member states the same legal principle when it comes to the asset as such. You always hear about tokenized securities. Yeah, that's just a circumvention. Yeah, you have the normal security in paper format that is then finally wrapped up by a digital wrapper. This is what currently being discussed. The burden and the negative side on this is all subject to English law. Yeah, we in Europe should be more straightforward and think about European civil law solutions and not relying on a third country law. Yeah, I think this is why we heavily promote to think about more like the German Electronic Securities Act. And the major pillar of making this work without the circumvention of tokenizing securities is the market infrastructure package, because this will change the CSD, the CSDR regulators, common securities depository regulation. And on this level, we need to change the term book entry. Yeah, and book entry means currently it must be a paper security, and this is planned to be changed so that it also captures from the very moment native digital securities, and we don't need this circumvention anymore about tokenization of securities, which doesn't make sense, yeah, from a legal perspective.
Well, I guess that still takes a long time until this happens, right? So we're not there yet. But David, what's your view on that? Do you face the same problems, or how does it look like in the U.S.?
So in the U.S. again, we have the standards called the Howey test. Comes from a 1946 Supreme Court decision that defines when something is a security. And the view of the SEC has been that the fact that a security is tokenized, or the fact that something is represented by a blockchain asset doesn't really impact whether or not it's a security. That the definition of security is form agnostic, and it has to do with whether or not the nature of what is being offered promises a return on investment based on the efforts of others. Is the crux of the test. And so that's the standard that they've applied. And the Clarity Act, which I mentioned earlier, isn't going to, I think, in a very fundamental way change the standard. But what the Clarity Act will bring clarity to, is something that happens a lot with these crypto assets, where they are kind of hybrids. They have features and characteristics of securities, but also in many ways they function a lot like commodities, and have uses as commodities. And in some cases, they even have functional uses, such as mediums of payment. And that's where you've seen a lot of the kind of the turf wars between the CFTC and the SEC, when you have these assets that have characteristics of both. And the Clarity Act attempts to really, that's I think the class, or not just I think, it is the class of digital assets that the Clarity Act is really focused on and trying to bring clarity to, the ones that might have characteristics of both, and it's trying to define exactly which regulator is in charge of them at different points in their life cycle. And that's one of the things that's interesting, is that it actually, for certain types of assets that during an initial offering would be securities, in secondary transactions, they would actually be treated as digital assets, not as securities anymore for some purposes. But it defines which regime they're subject to, and which regulator in turn has oversight over them. And it also, and this is I think something that you can't emphasize is important enough in the U.S., is it preempts, that is, has federal, when preempt is a term in the U.S. it means where federal law basically displaces state law. The normal rule is that if federal law, even if federal Congress regulates in an area, that doesn't mean that state laws are displaced. It just means now you have two sets of laws. But Congress can take one step further and say, no, we're actually displacing state laws in this area, and federal law is going to control. And that's what the Clarity Act would do in many respects. And that's important, again, because too many crypto asset activities in the U.S. trigger state money transmitter laws, which are very broadly worded, and getting those licenses and complying with those licensing regimes can be cumbersome, in part because they're not really well crafted or tailored to the regulatory issues that crypto assets present. So it's not just a matter of saying, it's too much regulation. It really is, in many cases, the wrong regulatory regime. And this would attempt to have a one that's more rational for crypto assets, and a standard one at the federal level, so you don't have to deal with this cumbersome patchwork of state requirements.
I've just recently read a headline a day or two ago, not so much clarity on the Clarity Act. So first of all, when is it supposed to enter into force, and where do we stand now in terms of the legislative process?
The Clarity Act's still in Congress, and passage isn't 100% guaranteed, although my colleagues who are very in tuned in the legislative space, they think it is going to, there's going to be deals worked out, and it is going to pass. That this is just normal. I mean, right now our political system is, I don't know what the right term is. Things aren't happening very effectively. Congress is not necessarily getting laws passed very well. Everything, there's an added layer of controversy beyond the usual. So it is hard right now to get a big legislation like this passed, but it does seem to have enough momentum that it is going to make its way through. There is also just a lot of controversy around the fact that Donald Trump and his family might have a personal pecuniary interest in crypto assets and how they're regulated, and that's complicated things because a lot of people say, well, this bill is just going to benefit him, and it might, but I think you've got to take out the just. I think actually both the Genius Act and the Clarity Act are good pieces of legislation, and regardless of what the motives might be of the Trump administration for backing them, I think they are widely regarded as good pieces of legislation. So hopefully that concern isn't going to become too much of a problem.
Okay, so hopefully all clear with the Clarity Act then. Patrick, maybe just a few words on the European perspective in that respect. You talked about the market integration package, and it's still a long way once we have it. But even then, I think we're not there yet, right? What are we still lacking?
I mean, from a regulatory side, we are pretty much there. Yeah, we have MiCA for crypto assets and tokenized assets, and we have the securities law. I think what is now going to develop is the market infrastructure, and as you pointed out in the beginning, this market infrastructure will not be completely new. Yeah, it will be based on the existing very important fundamentals that. Because capital markets participants like to have not only sound, they like robust systems. Yeah, this means that we have a lot of participants like exchanges, settlement systems, clearing houses that need to adjust to DLT-based infrastructure, and I think that's the way to go. It means a lot of technical developments, but I think at least also not only from a regulatory side, but also from protection side, what happens in the case of an insolvency of a participant in these systems? What happens about a true ownership interest in that asset? There's still a lot to be done, and I think this is often forgotten because we start with regulation and we as lawyers sit there and think about how can we protect our clients that they actually can claim this asset, that they are supposed to get. So I think for these purposes, we need to. Everyone is calling for a kind of a 28th law in Europe. Yeah, like in the corporate space, we now have in the upcoming month, the European Union Inc., a kind of a corporation, and that's what I said. I think we need a kind of a European modeled, unified insolvency protection and civil law principle that are commonly rebuilt in national law, and then I think we have a non-fragmented market in this area. The burden is that nobody thinks so much about these topics. It's then finally the legal literature and the professors that they try to get a way out, but we might think differently than the colleagues in the Netherlands and in Italy. So there's still a lot to be done, and market infrastructure is important, but I expect it still moves very slowly, and we will not from one day to the other be fully DLT compliant.
That's true, and I think what you point out is exactly right? I mean, these insolvency regimes, I mean, tax is also a topic, I think. They are not so, I would say, buzzwords or attractive than discussing stablecoins, right? And that brings us maybe to the second part of our discussions, right? The payment field and stablecoins. When we see the charts of where stablecoin markets are, we see 99.5% or so are in the US. Now, since we've MiCA regulatory frameworks in local jurisdictions, and we seem to be fine from a regulatory perspective and ready to go, I'm still wondering what can we do? What has the US done so much differently compared to us, and how can we leverage this into an economy where this really happens in practice, right? I mean, 99.5% of the entire market is US dominated. What can we do to leverage the euro stablecoins?
That statistic, every time I hear it, it amazes me because I think the answer just has to be it's just a cultural thing that especially in the Silicon Valley, using that term broadly, not just to mean the geographic area, but the kind of the whole industry and ethos it represents. Just in the U.S. has a willingness to push forward on this, notwithstanding the uncertainty, because from a regulatory standpoint, or at least from a legal standpoint, there's nothing the U.S. has done that has resulted in that 95%, because to the contrary, it's not been a particularly sensible regime for stablecoin regulation. There's a lot of uncertainty, and to the extent there's uncertainty, it is certain that regulations apply that make no sense in the context of stablecoin. So it's really a legal framework that to date has not been very sensible. Like I said, the Genius Act, I think, not just goes a long way, really goes a long way to fix that. It takes, again, stablecoin issuers, or many stablecoin issuers and other parties that deal in stablecoins, various parties in the ecosystem became subject to these money transmitter laws. These are the same licensing regimes that companies like Western Union, remittance companies, are subject to, and they're subject to regulations that don't always make sense for stablecoins, and they have to get 50 state licenses. And I can't underscore how difficult that is, and how difficult it is to have 50 separate examiners come in and look at you, and there are varying degrees of sophistication. Many of them, some of them understand, these digital assets quite well. Many do not, and that can be a real problem. So up until now, the regulatory and legal regime has been purely a hurdle to be overcome. And I guess it's just that there's been more people in the U.S. who have been willing to try to jump that hurdle. With the Genius Act, it's now going to be moved to take away the states. Now it's going to be implemented at the federal level. And it's going to be implemented with regulations to be adopted by Treasury. That's what I think is the biggest thing to watch over the next year or two. What happens with those regulations, and where do they go?
During the conference so far, we've also heard that in context of stablecoins, we discuss a lot tokenized deposits, tokenized money market funds, other means of payments, so as alternative products or complementary products. Is that also kind of a debate or a hot topic in the US, or is it just the stablecoin initiative? Do you, for instance, also deal a lot with e-money in the classical sense, in the traditional sense, or is it all about e-money tokens now, as it would be under MiCA in Europe?
I'll say it quickly because I see that we're about to be pulled off. But just to quickly say, in terms of tokenized deposits, I have worked with several clients on tokenized deposit initiatives. It's still, there's some banks that have already released some products in this area. Other banks are looking into it, and I think they're going to see more announcements very soon. The thing with tokenized deposits, ultimately, this is in many ways banks looking for a way to solve a lot of the problems that stablecoins are trying to solve. They're realizing that their existing legacy deposit and payment frameworks, interbank payment frameworks, have gaps that need to be closed. Stablecoin is one way to close them, and they are looking for other ways that they might be able to close them. Tokenized deposits tries to accomplish a lot of the benefits of stablecoins. There's commentators have mixed views about whether tokenized deposits are feasible and can do that. I definitely think they're feasible. I definitely think they can. I think it's going to be interesting, though, to see if banks also can find other ways to close those gaps, because I think many of those gaps could be closed without reliance on tokenization, to be honest.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
With that, maybe if there's time for just a quick outlook, 2 sentences, what we will be discussing.
No, I think
in
we're
2 weeks'
done, but I think
no?
the only thing that I wanted to say is, we always ask for the use case, and you always have to ask your questions, do you want to settle against the relevant asset? And I think that with that, I'm leaving you, maybe you think about it.
Oh.